Hello again, everybody. Gary Ferman and Stephen Wagner here, and this is your Inside Canes Recruiting Podcast. And Stephen, just I guess a few hours away from the Miami Hurricanes' 21st commitment of this recruiting cycle. Wide receiver Samorian Wingo, a guy that I know they worked very hard on for a long time, and it wasn't looking so good at first, but they hung in there and kept chipping away and chipping away. And then at the end, when it came time that Samorian Wingo had decided he was going to make his decision, the Miami Hurricanes were there to win out. Tell us a little bit about your impressions of that entire recruitment, the way it played out, and the fact that Miami ended up winning at the end of the day.
Yeah, so Miami has made a very clear effort to try to get physically bigger receivers along the perimeter, especially over the last two cycles. I remember talking to someone a couple of years ago, I think it was right after the 2024 cycle, and they kind of said, we want to get more guys who look like Josh Moore. Dudes that have that big, long, physical build on the perimeter that can be vertical threats who can go down and win these one-on-one contested catches, and maybe not have to turn to the transfer portal for guys like that. Wingo was absolutely a guy the staff was very interested in early. We always kind of felt like it was going to end up coming down to a battle between Miami and Florida. Then he took a multi-day unofficial visit to Miami in mid-March. Really spent his spring break on Miami's campus. The Hurricanes made a really strong pitch to him then, gained a lot of ground with him then. He came back for the Hurricanes spring game. Then eventually gets down for his official visit, and at that point, it's Miami, it's Florida, and it's South Carolina. It's those three schools battling. We thought that there was a point where it really, really, really felt like he was probably going to Florida. I know our guys over at Gators Online, the On Three Florida site, they put in RPMs for Samorian Wingo to go to Florida. Frankly, I agreed with them. I thought they were good picks. Then Miami just kept on hanging around. Miami definitely needed to make up a little bit of ground. There was a point where I was pretty pessimistic about Miami's chances of including Wingo in this class, even though I included him in my first two mock classes. I just didn't, I really didn't feel great about the Hurricanes' chances to get him coming off of official visits, but Miami, they chipped away. They renewed their effort. They made a really good push there at the end, and ultimately they were able to find a way to get it done. My understanding was Florida just kind of drew their line in the sand. They decided that Wingo was a guy that they were they didn't feel the need to absolutely throw everything at going toward kind of the end of his recruitment. South Carolina did remain very, very involved. I know the Gamecocks pushed really until the final minute, but Miami ended up winning out, and now Miami has three four-star receivers. So Miami has now taken, or yeah, I guess I should say, for including these guys in this cycle and assuming that they ultimately end up signing with Miami, Miami will have taken 11 receivers under Mario Cristobal from high school. Right now, 10 of those would have been four-star guys, and right now, 9 of those would have been players that would have been in the top 300, whether that's the Rivals 300 or the On 300. Miami absolutely is recruiting blue chip receivers. I mean, and I think they're doing it pretty well too. I know Kevin Beard gets a lot of crap for his recruiting because obviously, Miami hasn't had the whale splash 5-star commitment at that position. Obviously Jeremiah Smith, Miami missed out on a couple years ago. The Canes are still pushing for Tristan Keys. I don't know if Tristan Keys is going to end up at Miami. Vernell Brown, Miami was pushing really, really hard for, but he stayed pretty solid to Florida. But Miami has done a really good job of very consistently getting players that are in the upper echelon at receiver. They just haven't had that major splash whale commitment.
The relentlessness of Mario Cristobal pays off again here. He doesn't do all the recruiting himself, but he certainly sets the tone for it. And Miami just stays in the fight all the way through to the end and ends up prevailing for Wingo. Now, to me, what you mentioned is a very critical element to this, and that's big receiver. And fans have heard me talk for many many years about a lack of impact guys in the program. And size does matter in a lot of these situations. And if you guys are going to get introduced this fall to Joshua Moore, and he's a big kid who has a lot of ability, true freshman. We'll see how much he's able to contribute in year one, but you're going to see the dividends that a bigger, more powerful kid at that position can play. And I think that you're seeing a pattern now where Miami is trying to get bigger in spots, and receiver is certainly one of them. They're having a lot of success on the recruiting trail. Kudos to them. Now, at the beginning of the show, I mentioned 21 commitments now for this 2026 recruiting class. We're not even in August yet. Training camps haven't opened. You still got August, September, October, November. You still got 4+ months before signing day to do more recruiting. So, Stephen, I thought that we would focus the rest of the show here today on what comes next. What does Miami have left? What meat is still on the bone here in this class? In Mario's first 3 years, they've signed 25, 27, and 21 high school kids. So they're probably getting right around in the wheelhouse. We talk a lot at CaneSport about the transfer portal and is it being overused? And I've never seen it that way. I mean, I see high school recruiting and the transfer portal as complementary beasts to each other. And what you get done in high school recruiting, how those kids develop in your program, certainly impacts what you look to do in the transfer portal. I don't think we'll ever see a day where one of those two, well, obviously in high school recruiting, but where the transfer portal is totally de-emphasized. Makes zero sense to do that. As badly as you want to say I'm hitting on every single kid that I'm recruiting out of high school, it is just not reality. Right now, if you're looking at 45-50% hit rate in a good recruiting class, maybe you can get it up to 60, but if you do really good evaluations. But I don't think we're ever going to be sitting here in a world where we say, screw that transfer portal. There is no need to look there for better talent. Look at the way Miami has improved this 2026 team coming up in the transfer portal. But a big question now, like I said, is what meat is left on the bone for Miami, and where do they go from here? And Stephen, I'm going to give you the floor. You cover these guys on a minute-to-minute basis every single day. Talk to us a little bit about what does Miami have left now in these next 4 months for 2026, and what will we be covering this fall?
Yeah, well, it's funny that you said meat on the bone because I don't think there really is that much meat left on the bone. We're looking at taking food from other people's plates at this point. Right now, I think we're getting ready to get into flip mode. There's not a ton of dudes left that are uncommitted, that are still on Miami's board and still in play. Brett Collegier, the offensive guard from IMG. Frankly, I'm a little bit surprised they stayed uncommitted this long, considering the efforts that some of these different schools have made for him. Last time I spoke with him, it really sounded like it was Miami, Georgia, USC, and Oklahoma that were kind of rising to the top a little bit. With Miami and Georgia, it really does just come down to offensive line coaching, offensive line play, offensive line development, and the ability to put offensive linemen in the NFL. Mario Cristobal, Alex Miraball's record, and then obviously Kirby Smart's record over at Georgia. I know a lot of people don't think of Georgia as offensive line U, but they have averaged putting a first round draft pick in the NFL every other year since I think like 2017, maybe 2016. I think it was like after Kirby's first year. So they absolutely are developing offensive linemen, even if, their offensive lines haven't been as great in years past. Kirby does have that resume and record to fall back on. USC is making an incredibly aggressive push. They told him, "We are going to be drafting you. We're not recruiting you. We're drafting you." They are treating this. They are treating him like an NFL offensive lineman. They are really turning this. They're really taking an NFL approach to Brett Collegier's recruitment. And quite frankly, I think that's what Collegier really likes and wants to hear. I think that resonates with a kid like him because he has been straight up. There have been there's a lot of kids who they prefer not to talk about the NIL side, but in today's day and age, we're in the revenue sharing era, we're in the NIL era. Money has never played a bigger factor in college sports, and he's been straight up. He said NIL is going to play a really meaningful factor. He said he wants to go somewhere where he makes sure that he feels like he has a deal that he's pretty happy with, and USC is throwing some pretty serious freaking cash around. I'm not sure what you guys have or haven't seen, as far as what's been reported, the Trojans have been spending on this class. Their NIL collective has been incredibly aggressive, and so far it's definitely paid off because the Trojans do have, I think, right now the number one or the number two class. In the country, they're taking exactly the same approach with College A. Oklahoma has gotten really, really, really aggressive too. The Sooners, I thought, after the spring, had a ton of work to do with College A. They have closed the gap significantly. Now, that being said, they are still behind, I think, Miami and Georgia. Then I think it's USC after that. Then I think it's Oklahoma. But the Sooners have made quite a bit of progress. But right now, I kind of view it as Miami and Georgia is kind of 1A, 1B, and then a little bit of a gap. And then I think we're probably going to see USC. And just because Miami and Georgia, their collectives have proven that they are very competitive, and they do have the ability to spend when it's necessary. I mean, I think Miami's classes or Miami's collective has really proven that this year, quite frankly. And people will say, oh, poor Georgia. Oh, Georgia's so broke, they're out of money. Georgia is doing just fine. Look, especially considering some of the talent that they got in last year's cycle. Yeah, they are able to get some kids to take a little bit of a Kirby discount, but at the end of the day, that collective is still making sure that they find ways to be competitive. So yeah, right now, Collegiate really is the only guy who's uncommitted on the board, that I think is kind of a real priority for Miami right now. Cortez Redding, the safety, he's still uncommitted. He's going to be announcing his decision on July 25th. So right now, I do not expect Miami to make an incredibly aggressive push here. But I do think the Hurricanes are still going to be in the picture. It's kind of a battle between Miami and Indiana. I think if Redding decides that he wants to come to Miami, Miami will take his commitment. But I do not believe that he is equally valued or equally viewed the same way by everyone in the Hurricanes facility. So right now, I think I probably would lean toward Indiana. Just kind of seeing the way things are playing out, and the
Reading
way
the tea leaves.
yeah,
Reading those tea leaves.
reading the tea leaves, I think I would probably lean toward Indiana. Other than that, I mean, really at this point, it's flip season. We're getting into flips at pretty much every position. At offensive line, if Miami gets College A, great. If Miami doesn't get College A, they're not freaking out that much, although they would really, really love to have him. But the Hurricanes are done at O line after College A. They think if they go into signing day with six offensive linemen, they signed the six guys they currently have committed. They're going to feel really, really good about their class. They're going to be thrilled. If they get College A, they're going to be absolutely ecstatic. They are going to be beyond psyched with the class that they currently have, headlined by number one overall prospect Jackson Cantwell, who's probably going to be a plug and play guy. I mean, pretty much right away. Quarterback, Miami's also done. Darion Coleman, he's their guy. Been their guy since he committed last year. He's still solid. They're solid with him. Nothing's happening on that front. Running back, Derek Cooper. So, at the time we're taping this podcast, he hasn't yet announced his decision. But he is expected to go to either Texas or Georgia on Sunday. Right now, I would probably lean toward Texas, just because again, kind of reading the tea leaves. Miami is going to keep pushing very, very hard for him until signing day, but the Hurricanes are betting on themselves to win big this fall and kind of galvanize a little bit of momentum on the recruiting trail. I know that's one that's really going to sting Canes fans, but I moved my pick from Miami over to Texas last Saturday. and a couple of Texas insiders followed suit with RPMs earlier in this week. I think it was like Wednesday or Thursday. Some of the Texas insiders started entering those picks, and it seems like there's quite a bit of buzz surrounding the Longhorns. George is right there. George is pushing too, but pretty much the only thing I can confidently say is I'm pretty sure it's not going to be Miami on Sunday. Then
Stings. That one
yeah,
stings, Stephen.
that that that, that
I
is really,
I
really
understand what's going on there, but that stings, man.
yeah.
That's oof.
Yeah, and that's just kind of the unfortunate reality of where things sit. Um,
Let me just stop you for a minute there because I don't think people totally understand how complicated some of these recruitments are when you get into these big time kids, like a Derek Cooper who's being recruited by all the top programs in the country. Um, it is a lot easier for Texas, for example, to come in from out of town and just drop a big freaking number on the table than for Miami to do that because you've got kids on the current team that have NIL deals and their own deals and things like that, and you have a structure in your program. And now all of a sudden you got this elite high school prospect. As great as he is in high school, he still has not played a down of college football. Okay. And yeah, there's the Jeremiah Smith success stories, no argument whatsoever. But there's no guarantee, even when a kid's a 5-star, that he's going to walk in and immediately impact your program. And you can't disrupt the entire structure that you have put in place in your program for one kid coming out of high school just because Texas walks in and drops this big number. Now, if you get into the December and Mark Fletcher's blowing up and it looks like he's going to leave at the end of the year, and you've got Jordan Lyles sitting there blowing up. Now it's a little bit of a different deal because Miami at that point they know, okay, Jordan Lyle is going to get paid, and we need another guy, and now we can go out and battle for a Derek Cooper at the number that it might take because the dynamics of our roster have changed. And it's a fluid situation. I'm with Steven. I would not be the least bit surprised if Miami comes back here in December when it gets down to nitty gritty time and makes another bid here. They're right there with Cooper on face value. Let's be honest. Became a money deal here at the end, and Miami just is not in a position to play that game right now. But it could change by December. We'll see what happens. But I wouldn't give up on Derek Cooper. I'm with Steven on that. Go ahead, Steven. What else you got?
Yeah. Also, just real quick to tie a bow on Cooper, kind of from the Texas side. Right now, Texas is only planning on taking one back in this class. Miami wants to take two, so Texas can allocate a little bit more money toward one running back and just paying one back instead of two backs. Then, in addition to that, Texas is probably going to have one, possibly two backs come off the board at the end of this year. They've got a guy who kind of finished the year last year, Trey Wisner. I'm pretty sure he'll be draft eligible at the end of this year. And then C.J. Baxter, the legendary running back from Edgewater up in Orlando. He missed all of last season with an injury, but he would be draft eligible at the end of this year if he were to go off and have a really great season. So that means that Texas would potentially be having two backs end up coming off the board after this year. That just means that they can afford to spend more cash on running backs, both at the high school level and at the transfer portal. So kind of some one thing that you really have to consider, whenever we're talking about NIL and we're talking about budgets, is the way that is the current roster dynamics. If you're excessively loaded at one position, that's going to change, the way that you're able to spend on those high school kids. I mean, if you come in and you drop an absolute boatload of money on an unproven high school prospect, excuse me, and you have a veteran starter who's going to be returning and was really, really productive, and that starter sees what you're spending on a high school prospect, that starter is going to say, well, why the hell aren't I making that amount of money? You got to pay me too. And then we get into the weeds of things. Things get a little bit complicated. I think Miami's in a good position at offensive line. Kind of on that front because Miami's losing a lot of offensive linemen at the end of this year. They're losing Francis Mauigoa. They're losing Inez Cooper. James Brockermeyer, it seems like he's probably on a 1 year rental. Markel
Markel Bell, yeah.
yeah, yeah. All these guys are going to be coming off of Miami's books. That means that they can afford to spend a little bit more on that position at the high school level, and I think that's why we're seeing Miami be so extremely competitive and extremely aggressive in high school offensive line recruiting. So yeah, just kind of wanted to tie a bow on that little conversation, but kind of going down the board here at defensive line. Right now, it seems like Miami's probably going to have to get into targeting some flip guys. That obviously right now, it kind of seems like they whiffed on a lot of these really really top defensive line prospects. Bryce Perry Wright was the number one defensive lineman on Miami's board. They missed. He went to Texas A&M, but quite frankly, if I'm a Miami fan, I'd rather he be at Texas A&M than Clemson, because Clemson requires everyone to immediately shut down. It is legendarily hard to flip kids from Clemson once they commit to the Tigers. So, being at Texas A&M, I think there's still a little bit of an in there. Nolan Wilson went to Alabama. I've confirmed Miami is still in contact with him. James Johnson went to Georgia, James Johnson went to Georgia, then flipped to Texas. The night he flipped to Texas, I was told that Miami called him or called his camp that evening and said, "We're not giving up on you. We are going to keep pushing for you until signing day, and we are aware of what it is going to take." He already told me that he plans on getting to Miami at some point in the fall. Just kind of a question of when he's going to be able to make the trip to Miami, because he's going to make a trip to Texas as well. Um, Thinking down or going down. Thinking in my head, kind of going down offensive lineman. Miami missed the cut for Anthony Jones, the 5-star edge. I would imagine Miami's probably going to stay pretty involved there. But even though they didn't get him the first time around, this really isn't a great cycle for edge recruits overall. It's very very top heavy with defensive linemen. Lamar Brown, over at or committed to LSU. I think he's probably going to be hard to flip, just because of how strong his ties are to the area. He lives in Baton Rouge. He goes to a school that is basically like a setup school for students to end up going to LSU, that puts a crap load of high school football players at LSU. I think he'll probably be a hard guy to end up flipping. But I would probably expect Miami to keep their eyes peeled and see if maybe one or two defensive linemen don't kind of pop up for them this fall. Some guys that have just really really good senior tape that Miami wants to jump on, because that's happened to Miami each of the last 2 years at different positions. In 2024, Cole McConaughey kind of came out of nowhere. He was committed to Louisville. I wasn't even aware of his name whenever we found out that he was about to flip, in less than 24 hours. It was like, who the hell is this kid? Um, then Kellen Wiley last year, he had awesome, awesome, awesome senior tape. Miami jumped on him, and Miami started pushing really, really hard. And Miami ultimately ended up getting him on signing day. So those are two names that kind of came out of nowhere, had really, really strong senior tape, and then Miami ended up being able to land those guys. So this year, I would imagine, there's probably going to be one or maybe two guys that kind of pop up out of nowhere. Miami jumps on them, just because that's, kind of been the way this has really played out. Um, let's see, still going in my head. Linebacker. I think Miami is probably going to circle back on Samorian Watkins at some point. I think it would make sense, or he's committed to Texas A&M. I think it would make sense for Miami to maybe try to make a run at Jacob Eberhardt. I think that would make a lot of sense. Miami tried to get Julian Manson, the Iowa commit, down to campus during the spring. Really weren't able to make a lot of progress there. His father is actually a coach on the Iowa coaching staff. We'll see if Miami tries to make a run at some of those guys. Right now, at linebacker, this is really a weird class, because it kind of feels like there's Tyler Atkinson at the top, who kind of feels like like the consensus number one linebacker. It feels like there's a bunch of interesting guys, and then really just a bunch of players who don't really move the needle that much. Miami feels pretty good about the linebacker situation as they currently have. They're totally fine just going into the fall, just having Justin Edwards committed. They are not panicking. If they just have Edwards committed, because they understand, kind of the way this linebacker class looks. From a national standpoint, this isn't a great linebacker cycle. Jordan Campbell, they're probably going to view him as more of like an edge slash jack player. So, not really, really wouldn't call him, a true Mike or Will the way Justin Edwards is. At cornerback, got to think Miami's probably pretty close to done. They've got four corners that they feel really, really good about. Um, then they could potentially be adding a fifth if and when Kent Dobson in 27 completes his reclassification to 2026. I do know, though, that Miami is still pushing for Devon Benjamin. He's currently uncommitted. He didn't take an official visit to Miami, but Miami was able to get him down during the spring. Right now, he's the number one cornerback in the country out at Oaks Christian in California. Goes to the same high school that Hayden Lowe went to. Miami values him a lot, and he is one of the top players on Miami's board. They are going to keep pushing really, really, really hard there. Even though, right now I'm not excessively optimistic about Miami's chances, I do know Miami's involved. And then at safety. Man, I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's probably been the toughest position to recruit this year.
yeah, I don't. I really do not know where Miami goes from here.
Transfer portal.
Miami's going to have to flip some guys. They're going to try to have to flip Zach Fort. They're going to try to have to flip Devin Jackson. I don't know if they're going to be able to flip Blake Stewart. They're probably going to have to set their sights on trying to flip some guys at some of these other schools. I think Justice Fitzpatrick right now is probably pretty solid to Georgia. And plus, not to mention, he wants to play cornerback at the college level. So, man, right now, I think we really are in wait and see mode. If there's a position where I think that it's most likely that, a new name pops up at some point this fall, I would probably bet that it's going to be safety. I'm just not sure, specifically who that name could be right now. I'm really not.
Well, let's remember one thing. Miami's got a good schedule this year, and there's going to be several weeks here in the season where they can have big recruiting weekends, even beyond just Florida and Notre Dame. So Miami's going to be able to, if Miami shows up and plays the way that we expect them to this season and puts up an, 10, 11, 12 win season, they're going to have a chance to do a lot more damage here in the final weeks of the 2026 recruiting cycle. All right, well, that's going to conclude it today for our Inside Canes Recruiting podcast. You've seen the information on the bottom of your screen. If you are not yet a subscriber to CaneSport.com, know this. Your subscriptions are what allow our entire team to do what we do every day to make you guys the most informed fans in the country. We got a big season coming up here. Training camp starting soon. No better time to get on board and come on CaneSport.com and be part of our fan community. You will not be sorry. We really bust our butts all day, 7 days a week to bring you guys the best coverage humanly possible. But for now, for Stephen Wagner, I'm Gary Ferman. Thanks again for joining us, everybody, and we will see you next time.